And hello, Sachem, and hello to Allie, and thank you for inviting me, and a special shout out to Anne-Marie, who retired in 2020, for bringing me into the library last year to do a number of these video presentations for you. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is journalism, and in fact, I did op-ed pieces for Newsday between 2001 and 2005. I'm going to talk a little bit about presidents and how they impacted your lives, whether you know it or not, through sports and decisions that they made on sports, from Andrew Johnson on through Donald Trump. And Andrew Johnson is kind of an accidental president. He was not elected president of the United States in 1864. He was Abraham Lincoln's running mate, but he becomes president after Lincoln is assassinated in April of 1865, and he inherits a country that is split in two. The Civil War is coming to an end, or just about at the end, and Reconstruction is around the corner. And how do you put together a country split apart during a civil war? And this is one of the problems that's facing Andrew Johnson. And he and his advisors are thinking about, well, what is there a commonality? What's the commonality between people living in the South and people living in the North, between the Union and the rebels? Well, hey, we got it. It's baseball. Baseball. People like baseball. Baseball is becoming more and more popular. It's only been around in the United States for a generation or so, or played regularly by people in the United States for a generation or so. It was played among the soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. And maybe, just maybe, if we could do something with baseball, that is the first step in reuniting the two sides of the country. So Johnson brings in members of the Washington Nationals baseball team and the Brooklyn Atlantics baseball team to have lunch at the White House. Johnson was a baseball fan and knew people who were connected with the Washington baseball team. And he figures, well, maybe this will send out a signal that we could settle some of our differences, and we could do it by talking baseball. That was long before Terry Cashman talked baseball, 115 years before that song came out. Anyway, it is the first known official meeting between a president and an organized baseball team at the executive mansion. And it was done to show the country, hey, we have some commonality here. Baseball. Let's start with baseball. And he does. Johnson was a baseball fan, and he never attended a game during his tenure as president, which was 1865 to 1869. But he was a baseball fan, and he thought this might heal the country. He saw this as an opportunity to unite the country in the Reconstruction era, national unity through baseball. Ulysses S. Grant was the next president from 1869 to 1877. And some annals have noted that Grant would go behind the White House, where there was a baseball field or sandlot, so to speak, and he would, as part of his presidential duties, play baseball with the little kids in the neighborhood in Washington. Grover Cleveland didn't like sports all that much, but he would meet with Cap Anson. There is Grover Cleveland in this drawing, the president of the United States, meeting with the Chicago Baseball Club, those days the Chicago White Stockings. But Cleveland wasn't all that much of a fan, and he said, what do you imagine the American people would think of me if I wasted my time going to a ball game? But he did meet with baseball players. Theodore Roosevelt, it really has an impact on sports, college football per se. It's 1905, and there are many problems with college football, many problems, including the death of at least 40 college football players in 1904 and 1905. And Roosevelt is getting hammered by people saying, you got to get rid of the game. Now, how exactly you get rid of football in 1904, 1905 is a good question. He couldn't do it. But he's getting hammered by the president of Yale, of Harvard, Charles Eliot. And the two men don't get along. Of course, Roosevelt did go to Harvard. And Eliot is about ready to ban football. And Roosevelt has his reasons for not banning football. But he does threaten to ban football, you know, the bully pulpit in the Oval Office. And he basically says, hey, listen, there are 40 players who we know of that have been killed in the college level. We don't know how many died in the coal mines in Western Pennsylvania where the game is played. And besides, if you wanted to ban it, how are you going to stop people in the coal mine area from playing? They're playing, and they've been playing football for a while there. But he does threaten to ban the game because the 40 players had died over 2 years, and he is getting a lot of pressure on him. But nobody could figure out how Roosevelt could exactly end the game, because you could threaten to ban the game, but unless you have some teeth behind the ban and you get Congress behind you and you get law enforcement officials behind you, there's just no way you could do it. But he comes up with an idea. Let's make the game safer. Let's have some rules put into the game, and maybe we could get less of a death toll, because there are body counts. So Roosevelt brings the president of Harvard, Eliot, Yale, and Princeton into the Oval Office and says, fix the game now. Do something or else. What is the or else? We don't know. Now, Roosevelt hated the Harvard president, Charles Eliot. You know, whatever it is, I'm against it. The old Groucho Marx thing, the movie, right? Horse Feathers, where Groucho Marx is the president of a university, and that is Huxley University, and they want to be Darwin, and goes and looks for football players. But anyway, the Harvard contingent wanted to either ban football or change it. Walter Camp, who came up with the original rules of football in 1876, is still the coach at Yale University, and he wants to keep it as is. But if you looked at some newspapers in the United States, you might see that. That is a cartoon, when newspapers used to have cartoonists that was either satire or their take on society. And if you take a look at this, this is a skeleton, and there's a scarf wrapped around him called death, and you could see bodies laying on the field, the football field, and it's the center, and he's about ready to snap the ball. And if you notice, the ball looks a little different than the ball that is used today. It's the size of a watermelon, approximately. The 12th player in every game, death. And these are cartoons in newspapers back in those days. Roosevelt, I demand that football change its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. suffered major injuries playing football in high school and college. But Theodore Roosevelt thought that made a man of him. He was a rugged outdoorsman, and he was all about being outdoors and doing tough things. So he's got a problem here, because football is tough. He thinks it builds character, but he's being pressured by others to get rid of it. There is also one other factor here. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy back in 1898, before he became Vice President. And as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he decided he was going to get involved in battles in the Spanish-American War of 1898. And he had the Rough Riders, and they were the ones that went up San Juan Hill. They fought with him in Cuba. And when he looked at the occupation of his particular group called the Rough Riders, 10 of them listed their occupations as professional football players when they enlisted in 1898. So between his hatred of Eliot, his son playing football, even though his son was badly injured playing football, and the Rough Riders, Roosevelt kind of liked football. Not kind of like football, he wanted to see it flourish. So he decides, let's get these guys into my office and let's see what we can do. And the result was the American Football Rules Committee was formed. And in 1906, they designed plays that would open up the offense and make it supposedly less dangerous to play the game. Although we have found out subsequently, because of Dr. Benin Amalu, and others, that something called CTE accumulates on the brain from being hit over the head too many times, and that leads to disabilities in old football players. The game was not made, or the game did not become less dangerous to play. There would be another White House summit on concussions and football in sports in 2014, 109 years later. College football would survive. Pro football was kind of semi-pro at that point. Not really all that well organized, but somewhat organized in Ohio and the Midwest and the New York, Pennsylvania area. Anyway, the committee that Roosevelt had from the college presidents passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass, changing the distance gained for a first down from 5 yards to 10 yards, so you could throw a ball, which was a little different. And more importantly, mass formations, throwing players to get a first down in gang tackling were banned. Roosevelt is credited in some way in saving college football. Now, William Howard Taft didn't really make any decisions on sports. He really didn't make all that many decisions, but a couple of things that he did during his tenure as president from 1909 to 1913 lasted or have lasted through this day. Now, it's April 14th, 1910, and William Howard Taft goes out to opening day in Washington to throw out the ceremonial first pitch of the baseball season. Nobody had ever done that before, and Taft had no inclination to do it that day, except he had a bad day in the office. He had a really bad day in the Oval Office. Women suffragettes were in town at their convention, and they wanted the right to vote. Taft didn't think women should have had the right to vote, but they get a meeting with Taft in the White House in the Oval Office in the morning, and things are not going well for Taft because he has no real reason for women not to vote. But he is listening and listening and listening, and he's getting more and more upset. He slips a note to one of his aides and says, "Get me out of here. The Washington team's playing baseball today. Oh, come on, get me out of here. See if they could put me in there." The aide came back, said, "We're all set, boss. Let's go. We're going to the baseball game." He wanted to go to the baseball game with his staff to lift the spirits of the staff and him himself, and more importantly, to get away from the women, because the women wanted the right to vote. And they kept saying, "Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this?" And Taft had to get out of it. And he did. Now, Taft is a big man. He's well over 300 pounds. He once got stuck in the White House bathtub. And so he goes out to the game, and if you take a look at who's there, it's mostly men. His wife is there, a couple others, but it's mostly men. And he throws out the ceremonial first pitch. Okay, he starts a tradition. Not that he intended to, but he starts a tradition of throwing out the first pitch. No suffragettes there. He has a good time at the game. But it's the seventh inning, and William Howard Taft is a rather big man, as I said. He's got stuck in the White House bathtub. Seats in those days at stadiums, movie theaters, and other places, public places, the seats were about 19 inches across. Today, they're 23 inches across in baseball parks and other outdoor venues and movie theaters, etc. Taft was getting very, very antsy. Even though baseball games, there were no commercials back then. There was no TV, there's no radio, so they weren't getting money, the owners, from TV and radio. And games moved along rather quickly. In fact, there was one game that was just 51 minutes back in the 19-teens. Generally, the games were an hour and a half. But he's becoming fidgety. He's a big man. He's becoming very uncomfortable sitting in this 19-inch seat. So in between the top of the seventh and bottom of the seventh inning, William Howard Taft gets up, stands up. Everybody in the Washington ballpark stands up because, as a matter of respect, they think he's leaving. They stand up to show him respect. But he's not leaving. And he's standing there, and everybody else is standing there. He's kind of stretching out a little bit. Everybody else is kind of stretching out a little bit. And he sits down to watch the rest of the game. They sit down to watch the rest of the game. The seventh inning stretch starts because of William Howard Taft. Now, he probably didn't invent it. He was around Ohio in the 1890s, and there was some school of thought that people got up in between the top of the seventh and bottom of the seventh inning and stretched out. But nobody really gave it much of a thought until William Howard Taft did that opening day, 1910, in Washington. So because of the suffragettes wanting the right to vote, a couple things happened that's peculiar to baseball. The president throws out the first pitch, or for a long time did. And the second thing is that there is such a thing called the seventh inning stretch. People watched him. They thought he was leaving. He wasn't. Woodrow Wilson in World War II. Now, Woodrow Wilson had been the president of Princeton University. Princeton University played the first college football game back in 1869 against Rutgers, but he doesn't have much to do with sports, really, except for one thing. World War II is coming around, and he's trying to create a propaganda unit to sell people on enlisting in World War I or helping out stateside. And he decides, and his administration decides, why not use baseball? Baseball was deemed non-essential. The Army General Enoch Crowder convinced Newton Baker, the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, that any draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs like baseball should be forced to choose, enlist to help out stateside or risk going to the front lines in Europe. Hank Gowdy was the first baseball player to enlist in World War I. The United States got involved in World War I in 1917, which was 3 years after the war had started. The impact on sports with declaring war in Europe and the Americans getting involved was a shortened 1918 World Series that was played in September, and beginning of September instead of the end of September. The American League didn't want to play in 1918. The National League owners did. The Boston Red Sox and the American League would win the World Series. Many players enlisted in the war effort. So did he, Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, the war effort, get into the game. And Wilson was not afraid to use baseball imagery to help sell the war. Baseball was the only sport. Oh yeah, there was some horse racing around. There was boxing around with Jack Johnson and others back in those days. Jack Dempsey. In fact, Jack Dempsey was looked upon as a draft dodger like Muhammad Ali because he did not serve in World War I. He had to support his family. Get into the game. The Committee on Public Information was created by Woodrow Wilson, and here comes the national anthem. But it wasn't the national anthem back then. It wouldn't become the national anthem until 1931. It was a song called the Star-Spangled Banner. Starting in the 1890s, the Star-Spangled Banner was used at military bases when there was flag lowering every day. The Star-Spangled Banner and baseball, it was performed as early as 1897 at opening ceremonies in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia National League baseball team then, and more regularly with the New York Giants at the Polo Grounds beginning in 1898. In 1918, the Red Sox and the Cubs are in the World Series, and there's an Army band at Fenway Park in Boston that is just watching the game, and they were on hand for game one and seventh inning stretch time, right? William Howard Taft. All of a sudden they decide, hey, let's play the Star-Spangled Banner. And they played it, and they played it again and again and again in subsequent games of the regular playing of the song, the Star-Spangled Banner, at baseball games started in 1918. Oddly enough, the Chicago Cubs, the last team, not the last team to play the Star-Spangled Banner before a game in baseball, but their team first toured it in Boston. Herbert Hoover, he didn't really do much in baseball or in sports in general. The stock market crashed in 1929, and there was no recovery, and no recovery, and no recovery. Babe Ruth had a line. Babe Ruth in 1932 wanted $80,000 a year from the New York Yankees to play baseball. New York Yankees weren't really ready to give the Babe $80,000 quite yet. And he has a news conference, and there was one guy from one of the 11 or 12 or how many papers there were in the New York area, in New York City, maybe Long Island, New Jersey, and Westchester. Some guy says, hey, Babe, you know, if you get $80,000 a year, you're making more money than Herbert Hoover. And Babe said, what the hell has Hoover got to do with this? Anyway, I had a better year than he did. Hoover did do one thing. There was an amusement tax in 1932, and that levy was designed to raise more money for the United States government in its fight against the Depression. And the amusement tax included baseball, included the National Football League, and it included movie theaters and Broadway plays and whatever was left of vaudeville. It would hurt baseball. Attendance would be depressed. Sports, actually, the NFL is down to about 8 teams. The National Hockey League had actually more teams in 1932 than they would in 1939. There was no National Basketball Association. And Major League Baseball stood at 16 teams, but owners like Connie Mack would be selling off players because he had no money. With Philadelphia A's back in the 1930s. Now, I went to go see Franklin Roosevelt about 3 years ago up at Hyde Park. Very nice, very, very, very nice. We were talking, he and Eleanor were perfect hosts. Those books out there, they had books for you to read, and they didn't say very much, and they were a little stiff. But, you know, you got the point. You know, you're up there, you could ask questions and maybe get an answer. And I'm up there because I do 3 separate talks, one Jews in sports and the Olympics 1936, Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller not running in the 1936 Olympics. I wanted to know why Roosevelt sent the team to Berlin, which basically legitimized Adolf Hitler during the 36 Olympics. It was something about early days of TV. He was the first president on TV in the United States on April 30th, 1939, from the World's Fair, greeting people from the New York World's Fair, or greeting people to the New York World's Fair, and also the green light letter, which gave baseball the okay to play in 1942 after Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan and the United States jumped into World War II. Let's talk about 1936, because I got the answers, because he did answer it. Right? Did answer it. 1936 Olympics in Berlin, the Adolf Hitler Games. Actually, the Winter Games were also in Germany. They were in Munich. But let's concentrate on the 1936 Summer Games, because that was Hitler's coming out party. In 1935, the former Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy, Ernest Lee Jackney, and Jeremiah Mahoney pushed for an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Games. In fact, it was December 8th, 1936, that Mahoney made his plea to Roosevelt and others, let's not go to Berlin. Jackney was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he was outraged with the reports of what was happening within Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, 1935, he sent a letter to the International Olympic Committee's president, Count Henri Ballet-Latour, floating the idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Games. Mahoney recommends the Americans drop out of the Berlin Games, as I said, on December 8th. He was from New York. He was also the head of the AAU. And they were the ones who picked the people who went into the Olympics. A number of United States Catholic leaders joined with Mahoney, including the New York Governor Al Smith and the Massachusetts Governor James Curley, calling for the boycott. They crisscrossed the country and got nowhere. Roosevelt was staying out of this, totally staying out of it, until he said, yeah, let's send the guys to Berlin. The Berlin or Hitler Olympics, politically charged. Roosevelt urged the American team to go to Berlin. And he knew full well about what was going on with Jewish rights in Germany, as did Jackney, who had reports of that. There would be no boycott, and the guy on the left there is Marty Glickman, the fastest kid in Brooklyn. He's 18 years old in 1936. The guy on the right is Sam Stoller, who is 3 years older than Marty. They were supposed to be on the 4x4 relay team. Now, because of my background covering sports in New York in the 1980s for Mutual Radio and NBC Radio, they merged. I knew Marty. In fact, I worked for Marty's broadcasting school, helping out people like Leandra Riley and others as Marty tried to teach them how to do play-by-play on TV. And he still owes me $100. Next lifetime I'll get it. And Sam, I knew Sam from the Milrose games. Sam really didn't say all that much. Sam ran some races at the Milrose games, not running in them, but running the organization of the games, the Milrose games at Madison Square Garden in the 1980s. So he didn't say very much about it. Marty did. Marty felt that he was robbed of his gold medal, and that he was robbed of the chance to tell his grandchildren about his big moment in Berlin, where he got to have the medal in his hands and show it to the Fuhrer himself, Adolf Hitler. That never happened, and Marty died. He was very upset when he died, and I'm not sure about Sam, but Marty and Sam never got a chance to participate in the 1940 Olympics because the war broke out between Germany and the rest of Europe after the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. And the Olympics gone in 1940, gone in 1944 as well. Pearl Harbor is bombed on December 7th, 1941. The United States goes into war, and the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, says, "Dear President, what do we do now?" Roosevelt sent the baseball commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a letter. It's called the Green Light Letter, and it gives baseball the green light to play. Again, I'm up at Hyde Park, so I got my answer at the Presidential Library. This is the letter. "There will be fewer people unemployed, and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. That means they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work even more than before." And with that, Major League Baseball went on to a 1942 season. Hank Greenberg, the Detroit first baseman, enlists into the Army. He had been out and goes back in. He is the first Major League Baseball player to do so. Many other players would end up fighting in World War II, including Warren Spahn, who was at the Battle of the Bulge, and my old buddy Yogi. I used to speak at Yogi Berra's museum in Montclair, New Jersey. And I once asked Yogi about D-Day. And he was on the beach in Normandy. And I said, "Were you afraid?" He said, "Nah, they shot the bullets high. I'm short." Yogi. Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, was in the European theater during World War II. And Eisenhower lived through the Cold War that came after World War II. And he's elected president in 1952, starts his term in 1953. And he's looking for a hole in the Cold War with Khrushchev. And he's looking and looking, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And they come up with a plan. Let's have a cultural exchange again. So like Andrew Johnson back in 1865, North and the South, you know, we got a commonality, baseball, and Eisenhower thinks we have a commonality in sports and in theater. And it was a guy by the name of Bill Cleary who said to me, "Did you ever hear about the Eisenhower, the Eisenhower foray into the Soviet Union to bring down the temperature on the Cold War?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, this is what he did. He sent us as hockey players to the Soviet Union, and in exchange, there were cultural things that came over. One of them I used to love. Watching Ed Sullivan. I used to love watching the dancing bears from the Moscow Circus on that big stage with that really big shoe. Remember that really big shoe that Ed Sullivan had every week? So I got to see the dancing bears, and the Bolshoi Ballet also came over. So Eisenhower is trying to put a thaw in the Cold War, and he sends not only the United States national team there, but eventually National Hockey League teams with the Bruins and Rangers, Boston and New York, going over there because they never made the playoffs. 6 teams, 4 made it, 2 didn't. Boston, New York didn't. And then when other teams were eliminated, they sent other players to play in the Soviet Union, like Bobby Hull, who played with the New York Rangers during that tour. Anyway, there's Bill Cleary. And Bill Cleary is telling me all about this. I meet Bill Cleary in 1995 at Rockefeller Center at the ice skating rink. And USA Hockey is putting on a presentation honoring the 15th anniversary of the Americans winning the gold medal at Lake Placid and the 35th anniversary of the Americans beating the Czechs to win the gold medal in the Squaw Valley, Lake Tahoe Olympics in 1960. And he's telling me the story about, well, all these guys, they're firemen, they're college students, they're all young guys, and they all pick up and they leave to go to the Soviet Union, and they fly out there and they're put in this hotel, and it's modern neo-classical Soviet architecture, all gray. It's the only paint they had, all gray. So it's all gray and all that other stuff, but they're at the hotel. And they check their room for bugs to see if there are any listening devices or whatever. And they're called down to dinner, and they're going to have a big formal state dinner honoring the United States hockey players. And Cleary tells of going and eating with his teammates in the Soviet intimidation tactic of the day. He says they get into the room, and everything's really nice, and they go to their table, and they have the forks there, and the knives there, and the spoon there, and the napkin there, and the plate there, and the soup plate there, and the salad plate there, and inside the salad plate, oh, there is a model of the Sputnik spacecraft, which just went up, the first artificial satellite in space. The Soviets are ruling space. They get into space before the Americans. As Cleary said, as the Americans died, they were reminded that the Soviet Union, not the United States, was successful into getting into space first. And there is Sputnik, which was no bigger than a beach ball, weighed about 180 pounds, stuffed with a lot of electrical equipment that went beep, 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 beep. And that ended up in a rock and roll song later on, that beep, 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 beep. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did a couple things for sports. In fact, he did one thing that was one of his signals that he was about ready to get involved in the civil rights movement, lukewarmly, but get involved in it. The Sports Broadcast Act of 1961. John Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. He left one permanent impression on the sports world that to this day is the gift that keeps giving to owners from television, and I'll talk about that first. But he left really two things on sports. He created a massive revenue stream for sports owners from television by signing the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961 on September 30th of 1961. He's not really responsible for the legislation. That was done by a Brooklyn congressman by the name of Emanuel Seller, who I believe first started in Congress about during the time of the War of 1812. Actually, it was 1920, and this was 41 years later, and he's still the congressman out of Brooklyn. And he writes a bill that he gets absolutely no credit for these days. It's all Kennedy because he signed it into law, but he changed the sports landscape in the United States. The Seller bill allowed the National Football League to take its 14 teams at that point, make them one, and sell it to either CBS or NBC. Those were the only two networks that mattered in those days. So that was against antitrust rules, but the American Football League, which started in 1959, did that. And Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the National Football League, saw that they did that and got away with it. But they were a new business, and nobody knew if they were going to exist. By the way, the guy who brokered the deal for the American Football League and ABC TV, for the American Football League and its deal with ABC TV, was a guy by the name of Jay Michaels, who lived in New York City, moved out to California eventually. You might know his son if you watch Sunday Night Football, Al Michaels. Nepotism goes a long way in the sports broadcast business. Anyway, so the AFL's got this deal, and baseball has this antitrust exemption that they got in 1922 from the Supreme Court. So they sold all 16 of their teams, 18 of their teams in 1961 as one, and NBC bought it. But this allowed bidding between CBS and NBC because the National Football League, all of a sudden football is a hot commodity after the 1958 championship game between the New York Giants and the Baltimore Colts. And Roselle goes to Judge Alan Grimm in Philadelphia to see if this violates antitrust laws. It does. So he goes to Congress and asks Emanuel Seller, can you help us? Seller puts this bill together, 2 days through the House. Estes Kiefhauer, 1 day through the Senate, and it's up at John Kennedy's desk in September. And what it does, it evenly spreads broadcast revenues from the networks among the franchises, 14 in those days, and guaranteeing each team substantial annual revenues, which meant the Green Bay Packers would have the same money or access to the same money as the New York Giants. There is Emanuel Seller, who got it through the House. The act would also apply to the National Basketball Association, the National Hockey League, and other sports. Major League Baseball had that antitrust exemption. It didn't need the federal law to protect them like the NFL did. The other thing that Kennedy did was have the Washington Redskins football franchise owned by George Preston Marshall, who was a racist, desegregate. And George Preston Marshall did not hire any Negro players for his Washington team. He was the last holdout in the National Football League, and of the big four, whether it was the National Football League, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, or the National Hockey League, he was the last National Football League owner and the last league he's part of to have a color barrier broken. Now, he gives in because of a threat by the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration is getting all kind of civil rights heat put on them since 1961. They don't do very much. The 1961 Interstate Busing Act is one of the few things that they did. And in 1962, they're still sitting on their hands, but not on this one, because there's a lot of pressure coming from the Washington Post, among other places, and the Washington Post sports editor, Shirley Povich, and you probably know his son, Maury Povich, and his daughter-in-law, Connie Chung. And he's a sports editor. I'll give you a quick Shirley Povich story. Somebody asked him about Maury Povich, Who's Your Daddy show, you know, that show that's on every day, still is. And Maury was asked, he said, are you ashamed being a journalist of your son doing that show? He said, I was until I saw his paycheck. And I said, how could I get one of those? But anyway, he was writing things about George Preston Marshall, and he wrote in a column, when will the Washington team hire a Negro player? And George Preston Marshall replied, I'll hire a Negro player when the Washington Globetrotters hire a white guy. Washington's owner, Marshall, would give in because there was a threat by the Kennedy administration to bar Marshall from moving his football team from a federally funded stadium, which would be called DC Stadium, which is now facing the wrecking ball 60 years later. If you know anything about building municipal projects in DC, it's all federal projects. And it's also equal opportunity employment requirements. The federal government decided we're going to build a stadium for the Washington Senators baseball team, along with Marshall's football team, to replace Griffith Stadium, which, by the way, is sat on the grounds of traditional black school, Howard University. There is Udell, the Secretary of the Interior, with John F. Kennedy. Stuart Udell got into some negotiations with George Preston Marshall and said, you want to play in the new place? You're welcome. All you have to do is desegregate. And Marshall was looking for new revenue streams, of course, which a new stadium would bring as opposed to the old stadium, Griffith Stadium. Hire a Negro player or else, and Marshall finally did. He traded the rights to Ernie Davis, the Heisman Trophy winner, 1962. He drafted him, traded him to Cleveland for Bobby Mitchell, guy who I knew, who was Mr. Football in Washington. Any party that was of any consequence, Bobby Mitchell was there. And I said to Bobby Mitchell one day, he could have been a dentist. That's what he wanted to be. Could have stayed in Cleveland and then become a dentist, or you could become Mr. Washington. And he looked at me and laughed. He said, I guess that worked out well for me. I said, yeah, it did. And there is Ernie Davis, who was drafted. Marshall got a 30-year lease. Davis drafted by Washington and traded. He would die of leukemia in 1963. Marshall got his 30-year lease, and he hired 3 black players. and two others. John Nisby was one of them. I forgot who the other one was. But he had three black players, and he had his lace. John Kennedy revived the tradition of Andrew Johnson in inviting athletes to the White House. This was the Boston Celtics, the NBA team that won the championship. And of course, Kennedy was from Boston. Bill Russell is not with the team that showed up at the White House. And Red Auerbach, who's the coach, had some friends in the State Department, and tried to, in 1964, play a game in the Soviet Union. Never did. Khrushchev was afraid of Red Auerbach. Lyndon Johnson. What did Lyndon Johnson ever do for sports? Well, he did a bunch of things for sports. Inadvertently, a bunch of things. He ruined the traditional black schools, football programs by accident, and he signed legislation creating the Super Bowl. Lyndon Johnson signed the 1966 bill that would ultimately create the Super Bowl. Much of that legwork would come from the Brooklyn Congressman Emanuel Seller and two Louisiana politicians, Senator Russell Long, the fifth most powerful Democrat, the majority in the Senate back in those days, and Congressman Hal Boggs, who is Cokie Roberts' father. The Super Bowl was created in part by the 1964 Civil Rights Act that Johnson signed into law in July of '64. The Super Bowl roots can be traced back to a game that was never played, the 1965 American Football League All-Star Game in New Orleans. African-American players boycotted that game, and it set off a series of events that concluded in the first championship game between the American Football League and the National Football League nearly 2 years later in January of 1967. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, African-American players who were selected to play in New Orleans encountered problems. The players were denied cab rides into New Orleans and called names. If you were an African-American or a Negro, you could get a cab if a white guy was with you or a white woman was with you. Well, maybe not a white woman, but a white guy was with you. If you want to get a cab on your own, you weren't going to get it. That was part of the Jim Crow South. Cookie Gilchrist was a running back with the Buffalo Bills. He was the guy who led the boycott. The game was moved to Houston, which, as Abner Haynes said, was no day at the beach. New Orleans would become a political football. New Orleans was supposed to get an American Football League team that weekend. They were going to announce an expansion, the league. They didn't have a team. And because they didn't have a team, neither Long nor Boggs, who are two powerful members in the chambers, said, you know, what good is this merger going to be? It doesn't do anything for New Orleans. That is me in 1986 with Pete Rozelle. That is the steps of the courthouse, Foley Square, Southern District of New York, at the United States Football League, National Football League antitrust suit before Peter Leisure, who was the judge. Somebody must have said something because we're both smiling. I got a tie on those days. I should start wearing ties again. 1986, Fortune magazine. The NFL commissioner, Pete Rozelle, was lobbying both of them in Washington, and they said, we don't see how this is going to benefit New Orleans. Well, eventually a deal was stitched together, and a trade was made. We'll give you a team in New Orleans. You give us your support and also your allies in Congress. And they did. But there was also fence mending that had to be done with Emanuel Seller because 4 teams were going to move. New York Jets would be placed in Los Angeles Rams down in San Diego. Baron Hilton would take his San Diego team to New Orleans because they had business interests, the hotels, the Hiltons there in Oakland, and would move to either Portland or to Seattle. And that meant that there'd be 24 teams in 24 cities, which is what the NFL wanted. They did not want 2 teams in New York or in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area. But Seller said, you want my support? He's very powerful. All teams must stay. Seller was from Brooklyn. A lot of people in Brooklyn made the trip to Shea Stadium by car, big parking lot, or they transferred to the 7 train and watched Jets games at Shea Stadium. Seller prevailed. Lyndon Johnson would sign the bill on November 8th, 1966, allowing the merger. The AFL-NFL World Championship game was played in 1967. It would become the Super Bowl. In 1969, the game was played in a stadium that was 1/3 empty. Oh, I knew this guy, Richard Nixon. I did know him. I did know him. He solved the baseball umpires dispute in 1985, gave the umpires a big raise. He was asked by Richie Phillips to arbitrate. And I was a reporter in New York, and I knew Richie Phillips. I asked Richie, how'd you know Dick Nixon? And he told me, he said Dick Nixon would come down every weekend from his home in northern New Jersey to Society Hill in Philadelphia. And Richie Phillips' next door neighbor was Julie and David Eisenhower. And Dick and Pat would babysit, just normal grandparents. And so Richie Phillips said to Peter Ubroth, the baseball commissioner, how about let's do arbitration? So who do you got in mind? Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon, no way. Well, yeah, okay, let's do it. And I met Nixon and got to know him a little bit after that because I was covering sports baseball at the time. And Nixon would hang around Shea Stadium and Yankee Stadium. I got his autograph and got to see some stories and got to talk baseball with Dick Nixon. That's what he liked to do. Dick Nixon almost became the commissioner of baseball in 1965. Nixon goes to China in 1972. 1971, the United States table tennis team traveled to, Stewie Gates is going to love me, my 9th grade teacher, 1969-70, Spring Valley Junior High School in Rockland County in New York. Stewie is still around, still answering phones at the Stony Point Fire Department. They retired him a few years ago from going up a ladder, and he's 90, 91, 92 years old now, and putting out fires, so he answers phones. Anyway, Red China, Communist China, to challenge a Chinese squad in April 1971. It was called Ping Pong Diplomacy and produced a thaw in the United States-Red China relationship. During the 1971 World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, a 19-year-old named Glenn Cowan, who actually played ping pong at the beach clubs in New Rochelle in the 1960s. My wife would see him around at one of the beach clubs there when she was going there in the 1960s. Anyway, hopped on the shuttle bus carrying the red-shirted Chinese national team. Chuang Zhang stepped forward, shook Cowan's hand, spoke with him through an interpreter, gave him a gift. Now, whether this was spontaneous or not, we'll never know. Cowan is dead, Mao Zedong is dead, and Zhang isn't talking. Cowan said he was a self-described hippie. Well, the hippies died in 1967. There was an actual death of a funeral procession in San Francisco done by the Diggers in Haight-Ashbury. But anyway, he returns the gesture the next day, gives him a T-shirt blazoned with a peace symbol and the lyric from Paul McCartney, "Let It Be." And that's how, allegedly, China is opened up by these two guys. Mao shocks the world, invites them to an all-expensive paid trip to China. That's not a bad deal. It's like being on a game show, right? You lose, that's your consolation prize, because they lost, but they got a consolation and parting gift. After checking with their embassy, the American players accepted. The American team wasn't very good. It wasn't a good team, and it was guys who begged for money to go to Japan. Nixon would say, I was surprised as I was pleased. I never expected that the China initiative, would come to fruition in form of a ping pong team. On April 14th, 1971, the same day that the American players met with Zhou Enlai, Nixon announced that it was easing its travel bans with the trade embargoes against China. Zhou Enlai was number 2 in China at that point, behind Mao. The American and Chinese governments soon opened back-channel communications with one another. Also during the Nixon days, the Mrs. Education, that is Edith Green, Oregon Congresswoman, got to the Senate in 1954. She was from the 4th District. and she came up with this Title IX thing. What was Title IX? Well, Nixon signed in 1972, June 23rd, 1972, the Title IX legislation that was designed to give women an equal opportunity to get an education in American colleges and universities with men. Somehow it has morphed into a sports piece of legislation. Wasn't supposed to be, as my friend Donna DeVerona, who helped me with a Title IX talk that I give every March, told me. Title IX, no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The battle of Title IX in women's sports, and Donna DeVerona said to me that there was a mistake when they wrote up the legislation. They decided to throw in sports in there, not thinking that sports was part of the education process at schools, university, and colleges. Big mistake, she said. Huge mistake. And through 2021, people are still talking about, well, we got to do this with women and that with women, it's taking money away from men, etc. The battle of Title IX legislation in women's sports is still being fought, with some coaches and athletic directors crying foul, saying, we have to cut men's sports programs and keep women's programs to stay in compliance with Title IX rules. Donna DeVerona said if they could do a do-over, Donna won 2 gold medals as a teenager, swimming in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, so she's part of this. And she said if we had a do-over, we would just say all educational opportunities and not put sports in there. Also, Nixon's watched the Munich 11, the Munich massacre in the 1972 Olympics, the first time that Americans saw terrorism in their living rooms, played out live on ABC TV during the Olympics. And Jim McKay did a great job as the traffic cop, getting everything that you saw on TV, making sure you understood what was going on. Costello was there as well. Howard, I do a TV talk and other talks about Howard. Howard and I had a good relationship, and I'm still friends with his grandkids, Justin and Colin. Nixon was very upset with the Olympics going on in 1972 after the 9 Israeli athletes and the 2 coaches from Israel were killed in the botched rescue attempt by the Germans. He sends a letter to Avery Brundage, of whom Cosell once said came of age during the time of William of Orange, Netherlands, back 400, 500 years ago. Anyway, Nixon sends a telegram to Brundage, Avery Brundage, who called the 1936 Olympics the finest Olympics ever, and who might have been behind the decision to stop Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller from running in their race and denying them the chance of the Olympic gold. Anyway, Nixon in telegram demanded that the rest of the games be called off, but this guy, Avery Brundage, said about 25 words about our Israeli friends and then said the games must go on, and they went on. Nixon also wanted to watch football. You know, hey, look, he wants to stay in the residency in his T-shirt, doesn't have to shave. Maybe he's just wearing his underwear. He just wants to watch his friend George Allen's Washington team play in a playoff game against Green Bay. Hey, he's the president of the United States. I don't want to leave the White House. I don't want to go up to Camp David where I can watch the game because, you know, Baltimore stations probably have it on. I don't want to do that because there is a banned 75-mile, allegedly 75-mile rule that you can't show a game locally if the team is playing, protecting the gate at a home game. In 1950, the NFL commissioner, Burt Bell, told his owners to black out home games to get people to buy tickets for home games instead of sitting in front of the television. His plea came after owners saw that the LA Rams had a 50% drop in attendance in 1949 compared to 1948 after the team signed a deal to sell Admiral televisions in Southern California, and Admiral put up money for that. And there was a football card you could have gotten of Dick Huffman, who was with the Rams from 47 to 49. They wanted you to come in and buy a TV and sit in front of your TV and watch the Rams at home, where there are no lines to the bathroom and the concessions don't cost you an arm and a leg. By 1951, the NFL was in the courtroom defending its blackout policy. Alan Grimm, the judge who I mentioned a little while ago in Philadelphia, upheld the league's blackout policy, believing it was not in violation of antitrust laws. A problem surfaced in 1957 when Detroit could not show the game, even though the game was sold out, so it wasn't on TV in Detroit. Grimm said no to the NFL selling all 14 teams as one, but he did say yes to the blackout rule. So Nixon has nothing to do Sunday. You know, he just wants to sit around in his underwear, watch football, maybe drink beer or whatever, do whatever you do watching football. There is Nixon to his left, your right, George Allen, the coach of Washington. Interesting guy nonetheless. Had a photographic memory. I dealt with him. He was an interesting character. Of course, his son became the senator from Virginia, George Allen, and that guy with the goofy smile with the Washington hat, Marv Levy, the only coach. I like Marv. Marv was the only head coach in NFL history that had a degree from Harvard in English literature. Marv used words that I never understood. Officious. So let's do this Jack Webb style. Bum, 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 bum. December 18th, 1972, 2:06 in the afternoon. Nixon meets with Attorney General Richard Kleindienst at the Executive Office Building. The reason? He wanted to watch his friend George Allen's Washington NFL playoff game, but couldn't. Is there anything I could do? Yeah, come on, you're the Attorney General. You could do something. Washington is playing Green Bay. It's on Christmas Eve. Game's blacked out in Washington. The game is sold out. The most powerful man in the world wants to watch this football game. Maybe in his t-shirt and shorts, having a beer and some pretzels in front of him in the residence at the White House. Can't do it. A compromise would eventually be reached by 1973, which allowed NFL teams to show home games if the games are sold out 72 hours or earlier prior to kickoff. It was a 3-year rule that was supposed to expire in 1975. It just carries on and on and on. Gerald Ford was a great football player at the University of Michigan, president of the United States after Nixon. And he came up with something, he came up with a IRS text code revision for the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Why? Because the NCAA believes in something called principle and amateurism and looks after athletes by keeping them away from the temptation of professionalism and commercialism and looks after the best interests of student athletes. The group got special tax exempt status as a charitable organization. College football teams that play in bowl games do not have to pay, they can collect all the money, they don't have to pay taxes on the monies collected during bowl games. Now in 2021, athletes are going to be able to sell their faces to make money off of their faces in college sports. Jimmy Carter had the problem with Afghanistan in 1980. Jimmy Carter gave the Soviet Union an ultimatum: pull your troops out of Afghanistan by February 20th, 1980, or the United States would boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Eve, 1979. They did not pull out. The United States would pull out on March 21st from the Moscow Games. They were joined by 60 other countries in the boycott. This was also the backdrop, the United States playing the Soviet Union, Lake Placid, New York. USA, 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 or for the first time in Lake Placid. That's the Friday game. That is not the championship game. The championship game would come against the Finns. And in fact, Soviets could have still won the gold medal even if they were beaten by the United States by winning their next game, scoring X amount of goals, the United States losing to Finland, and whoever scores the most goals wins under some complicated way of doing things. But the United States would win the gold medal, and Carter would call her Brooks after the Soviet game, not after they win the gold medal. And it was a big deal, propaganda-wise. Carter would also issue a trade embargo on two goods that the USSR desperately needed: grain and information technology. Think of that, 1980. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled waters. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989. The boycott was a failure. Under Ronald Reagan's watch, the Soviets did not come to the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Reagan does two things: Cable TV Act of 1984, which was meant to save ESPN and the Weather Channel and some other things that were on TV at that point, ESPN. They were losing money, and what Reagan did was socialize cable TV, and those networks went on a basic expanded tier. You could take the local tier, you could take both, but you couldn't cherry pick what you wanted. If you took everything, if you took the basic tier, you had to take everything, which in those days included ESPN, CNN, and the Weather Channel. It was all or nothing at all, as Frank Sinatra once sung. No choice. The legislation saved ESPN, CNN, and others from financial ruin, and sports operators got money, major money, from cable TV, starting their own networks or cutting deals with people who started sports networks on cable TV. That is the ballpark in Cincinnati. I could have picked any park, but I picked Cincinnati because I'm going to give you an example of Cincinnati. Reagan in 1986, bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans in both houses in the Senate, both the House and Senate, send up the 1986 tax code reform to Ronald Reagan, who signs it. The tax code reform opens up a huge loophole in the tax laws and gave sports owners ammunition in negotiations in their battles with cities and states to get new stadiums or renovated stadiums. The law gave municipalities a federal tax exemption on bonds to build new stadiums. After the 86 tax code revision was passed, sports owners figured out that under the right set of circumstances, an owner could keep up to 92% out of every dollar generated in a publicly funded stadium or arena, which left 8 cents, which means places in Cincinnati, because the 8 cents wasn't enough to pay off the debt, would have to raise property taxes, lay off workers, and do other things to pay off debts at stadiums. Cincinnati built a football stadium and a baseball stadium. George W. Bush. I spoke at the George Bush Presidential Library in 2007. As a State Department job, yeah, you're looking at me, your tax dollars at work, because it was your tax dollars that paid for me being there. And I was giving politics and sports business talk to 16 foreign nationals, 3 from Turkey, 3 from Venezuela, 3 from Indonesia, 3 from Nigeria, 3 from Russia, not exactly friendly countries to the United States. They threw in a Canadian there, who I discounted 75%, and he laughed at that joke because of the currency being discounted, and 4 Americans. But I did speak at the Bush Library, which is the highlight till today, when I speak to you, of my speaking career. In 1990, George H.W. Bush signed into law the Anabolic Steroids Control Act. The legislation made the possession of steroids without a physician's approval illegal. And it was ignored by sports leagues, as you probably know. Bill Clinton tried to solve the baseball strike of 1994. It was an ill-fated move on his part because they were not going to listen to Bill Clinton. I covered that in 1994. So I knew what was going on between Don Thier and John Harrington, and before John Harrington, Richard Ravitch, who was the former chairman of the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, who was fired as the baseball negotiator, replaced by John Harrington. So I knew what was going on there, and it was ill-advised for Clinton to get involved, but he did get involved trying to hammer out an agreement. He failed miserably. That was settled by Sonia Sotomayor, now a Supreme Court Justice, in April of 1995. I was in the courtroom when she said, play ball. She found the owners bargained in bad faith and ordered new negotiations. They solved it and had a deal. In 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Curt Flood Act. which gave baseball players the same rights under American antitrust laws that basketball, football, hockey, and soccer players enjoyed in negotiations. George W. Bush, the former chairman of, not he was the chairman, he was the managing general partner of the Texas Rangers, owned 2% of the Rangers when I met him back in the 1980s, early 1990s. A guy who wanted to be commissioner of baseball, didn't necessarily want to be the president of the United States. In 2004, in his State of the Union address, there was a segment on steroids. His father signed the steroid legislation, making it illegal without a physician's approval legislation 14 years earlier. By 2005, Congress held hearings on the use of steroids in sports. The Bush administration provided a good deal of the security for the Athens Olympics in Greece in 2004, part of the war on terrorism. Barack Obama tried to get the 2016 Olympics for Chicago, another ill-fated attempt that he should probably have listened to people like me who knew what was going on. The 2016 Olympics were going to South America, going to Brazil, the BRIC countries that at that time their economies were on fire, Brazil, Russia, India, China. They were going to South America, the Olympics, because they wanted Brazil. The Olympic failure, and this is Obama's words. I remember this vividly when Chicago had the bid for the 2016 Olympics. A very effective committee had flown to Copenhagen to make their presentation, and Michelle Obama had gone with them. I got a call, I think, before the thing had ended, but on fairly short notice, that everybody thought that if I flew out there, we had a good chance of getting it, and it might be worth essentially just taking a one-day trip. So we fly out there. Subsequently, I think we've learned that the IOC's decisions are similar to FIFA's decisions. FIFA, the governing body of the World Cup in soccer, and they also have massive legal problems, as does the IOC. Bribery in both. A little bit cooked. We didn't even make the first cut, despite the fact, by any objective metrics, the American bid was the best. Obama would also have a concussion summit. And he didn't know Teddy Roosevelt had his football summit 109 years earlier, talking about concussions in athletes, particularly in cheerleading, women's soccer, and of course in football. A grand show, but nothing happened. The NFL, the movie Concussion came out. Dr. Amalu Bennett Amalu came up with the CTE. It's all been swept under the rug. Nobody talks about it in this day and age. Donald Trump, during his presidency, pledged support for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics bid, pledged support for the 2026 World Cup bid of soccer that will be hosted by 3 countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and pardoned Jack Johnson, who was convicted under the Mann Act of immoral behavior because he took a woman over state lines for immoral purposes. That was the Mann Law, signed into law by William Howard Taft back around 1910, 1911. Some of the other people who got nailed under the Mann Act included Charlie Chaplin and Chuck Berry. So presidential decisions matter to the sports industry. They've had lasting effects. Andrew Johnson, Teddy Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Obama, and Donald Trump. Thank you so much, Allie, for inviting me. Thank you for being a great audience. My name is Evan Weiner. And until the next time, when I see you again, have a great day, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye now.